Welcome back, everyone. Thanks for coming out. I am really excited to be here today with Whitney Koo, editor of Gasher. Welcome so much, Whitney.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, so let's jump right in. Gasher is a relatively young magazine, right? Can you tell us about when it was started and what on earth prompted you to want to start a literary magazine?
Yeah, so I started Gasher in 2018. I kind of started putting it together at the tail end of 2017, and it
Mm,
happened to be the last year of my master's. And I was somebody who went like straight from my undergrad to my MFA, and so I really had no idea how to participate in a literary community outside of these very designated, structured kind of
mm,
zones. And I was at the tail end of my MFA and I had applied to PhDs and I was pretty confident I was not going to get in,
mm,
anywhere. So I was, trying to think, well, how do I do this? Like, how do you stay, really active as a writer and, as a community member? Um, kind of in the real, I was young, I was kind of immature in that regard. So I had been told, in workshops that I gave, good feedback, kind of that I had a kind of a smart editorial eye. So I had thought, well, maybe I'll start a literary journal, and that would be a way of just building community around me. And so that's how Gasher started. And we started with, it looked very different from what it does now. I started with a monthly online publication that was like micro doses. It was like maybe 4 poems, or something like that, like 4 poets, because the idea was that you would just kind of read it on like the train ride, to school or something like that. So that's where it started, was these kind of like micro batches, and then we did one in print journal at the end of the year that was like more full length. And that only lasted the first year because it just wasn't a very sustainable structure. And then it moved to what it's kind of known now for, which is its online quarterly issue of visual art, poetry, fiction, and creative nonfiction.
mm.
And then from there, we branched out to chapbooks, and now we also have the press side that's doing full length. So we have, yeah, it's kind of just spiraled from there.
That's great. Well, congratulations.
Yeah.
So tell us, in forming the magazine, it sounds like you were kind of on your own. Like, who did you consult? How did you get ideas for what could work, what wouldn't work? Or did you just kind of make it up as you went along?
I didn't have a lot of feedback. I didn't really tell many people that I was doing it, just because I don't know, I didn't know what was gonna happen, like if it was gonna be a big flop. So I kind of didn't tell anyone about it. Um, so I just kind of thought of it, I was thinking of the way that I was reading journals, which was that I didn't have a whole lot of time to sit and read really large issues. And so I had thought about these like micro doses. You could open up an issue and consume 4 or 5 pieces, on your way to work or while you're sitting waiting for the bus, or at the doctor's office, and it would be a lot more consumable and accessible.
Mm.
Um, and so that was how it started. But pretty soon, only about 6 months into the first year was I solo, and I really was just kind of like begging everyone I knew to give me work. And then I ended up getting help from our now editor-in-chief of the journal, Erin Armstrong, who is fantastic, and she's been the managing editor all the way up until this year when I split off to focus on the press, and she took over the main role at the journal. And when we started working together and we moved to this new model, we started having a lot more conversations about mission and craft and what were we actually interested in focusing on. And that came from having somebody else to talk to and like
Mm.
collaborate with. And that's when we really started to hone in on our mission. For us, we are really dedicated to emerging writers, and accessibility is kind of our bread and butter. We were looking for ways of making publishing more accessible, because it's a pricey game,
Mhm.
and so we're looking like, how can we make it so that you can afford to submit your first book? Because I mean, if you're doing $25 a pop a submission for 2 years, I mean that's just not sustainable. Or
Mhm.
a lot of journals are having to start taking submission fees for online publications, which I don't think is anyone's fault. It's rough running a literary journal, but we really were asking ourselves, how can we keep submission free? Just again, because I think it ends up keeping some opportunities away from certain writers. So
Mhm.
that kind of became our mission, and that's where we've kind of really grown from. Is
Mhm.
that mission that we kind of built together over time.
Sure. So does that mean you do not charge submission fees?
Not for our digital issue, no. And even for all of our contests and scholarships, we don't do submissions. So we have a first book scholarship that is free to submit to.
Mhm.
We award two $250 prizes for you to submit your first book manuscript out. We do the Bennett Nyberg Transpoetic Broadside Prize, and that is free to submit to. And that had, this past year, it had $1,000 prize. I think this year it'll have a $500 prize. Um, that's free to submit to. And then our online journal is always free to submit to as well.
That's great. So can I ask, how do you sustain the magazine? Because you use Submittable, right? Which a lot of editors complain is like the mafia.
It is the mafia.
Um,
CLMP having a membership as a literary
okay.
journal, I think is pretty necessary if you're going to use Submittable,
Mm,
because the CLMP membership gives you a discount on Submittable, so that's important. The first 2 years of the journal, I funded it
mm,
myself. I mean, I paid for everything out of my pocket. I had a second job to help me fund the journal.
wow.
That's how important it was to me to keep it running.
Mm,
Now we have book sales that help keep our journal submissions open. We're also an all volunteer staff, so we're not paid employees. So our staff does it just out of the goodness of their heart, which we're really grateful to. And the Bennett Nyberg Prize, Bennett Nyberg's family is the one who sponsors that prize, so they gave us a very generous donation to keep that
mm.
prize going for the next 10 years. So donations, sales, and then I think just having an amazing staff who's willing to put in a lot of labor of love is kind of
Hmm.
how we do it.
That's really impressive. So you were working a second job to keep the magazine afloat. Did you ever think, this is nuts? Like I could just, drop the magazine and have more time to write? Or were you like it sounds like you were just like so sure that you needed to be doing this.
Yeah, I have that feeling a lot even to this day. Like, oh, man, could you imagine if you were like just a writer? Like you know, right? You could write your own book, but I found so much reward out of seeing other people have space and being a part of like creating that space for others. I think it's really important work, because again, if you're not doing it, does that mean that that's one less place that somebody has an opportunity
Mhm.
to submit to for free when they don't have the means to submit, to
Mhm.
submissions, or making it possible for somebody to submit their first book by having that scholarship. So I mean, I was really motivated by just passion, yeah. And then but I will say it's not always consistent. I mean, there are times that I get a lot of fatigue as well. So
Yeah,
I mean, that's the game, I think,
makes
of
sense. Yeah.
journals. Yeah.
So we have a question here, and I think I forgot to say it at the beginning, but of course, if you have any questions, go ahead and type them into the chat. Tamara says she thinks she missed a word. What is seal no? And I think what the question refers to is CLMP, which you said is a big support to fledgling literary magazines, which for anyone who doesn't know, it's a council of literary magazines and presses, and you can become a member. And they actually, well, I'll let you tell us, like, what are the benefits of membership?
The big one is Submittable, but they also have prizes. So Gasher was a finalist for their best new literary journal in 2020, or maybe 2020. So there's ways that you can kind of win prizes money wise there. There's also a database of tools and resources, so it is It does cost money to be a membership there, but if you are wanting to use Submittable, it makes Submittable like a third of the cost, which
Mhm.
I mean, yeah, sustainability is penny pinching is the game, you know? So
Sure. Yeah, so the question is, I'm curious how to be part of Submittable without the extraordinary fees, which I think a lot of editors are trying to figure out these days. I see some editors are working, they're using Duosoma, they're using like, or just private email addresses. Like, there are alternatives to Submittable, but it's kind of
yeah,
tricky.
there are some alternatives, and we've looked into some of them ourselves before joining CLMP because it was just unsustainable to keep going with Submittable at that time. It depends on your journal size, I would say, for one. I mean, we used Gmail, just email submissions, and there's a lot of, really fantastic journals that still do email submissions,
Mhm.
which is, totally free. I think the what you'll want to do is make sure you have a smaller editorial staff because you don't want like 20 people trying to work off of the same email. Or what you do, which is something that I've heard other journals do, is that you have the one email that accepts all the submission, and then whoever the editor in chief is would kind of forward submissions to the appropriate editor at their kind of different designated kind of email. And I think that does work as long as you have kind of a smaller staff, just because again, too many hands in the kitchen is not really workable. We have a pretty large, staff that we work with at this time, but at the beginning we used Gmail and it worked great for us. So there are ways around it, and I know there's a lot of really great journals that have been around way longer than Gasher and still use, email submission, and seems to work for them. So
Mhm. So, since this is really your project and you've been around, you've created it from the very beginning, can you tell us, is there anything that you've learned that maybe you would have done differently? Or if there are people listening who are thinking about starting their own literary magazines, any major pieces of advice that you could offer them?
um oh, that's a great question. uh, I don't know that
Yeah,
I'll
I
have.
imagine a lot of it is really just learning as you go, and very
Yeah.
specific to whatever project people are trying to create.
One thing I will say that I have told when I've sit on panels for talking about literary publishing before is I tell people, if you're going to start a literary journal, really know where you're fitting into the landscape. There are an abundance of literary journals out there, and there's a reason why some of them really never get off the ground versus other ones that can kind of grow really fast. And I think knowing where you're filling a gap or what you're bringing that's new or offering something kind of specific. Our managing editor Aaron started a separate journal called Ice Queen Magazine, which is all food based,
Hmm.
and you submit your food, kind of creative writing, like where food appears, but also you do an interview and donate a recipe. And it's this
Hmm.
very specific kind of niche in literary publishing. So I think knowing where you fit. When I started Gasher, I was just starting another literary journal, but I didn't have a lot of direction in terms of like what kind of aesthetic were we after, what was our mission, all of that I think is important to know up front so that you know how to market yourself, because a lot of it is marketing yourself. What do you offer to the literary community that's not being offered currently? So I would say that was probably my best advice.
So that said, can you define for us what is Gasher's unique offering, or how do you see its kind of position in the landscape?
Yes, so we're again a journal that focuses on accessibility. So we are the journal that you come to if you want to get support for writing. We have our internship, our reading internship. We obviously do a lot of scholarships and prizes. Or if you are someone who's never been published before, or a young writer and is looking for a journal that's friendly to emerging writers. We just signed a new chapbook that's written by a senior in high school. So we're open to new voices and emerging voices. And all of our projects are going to be based around accessibility in publishing, who has access to these certain avenues. So that's where we see ourselves. Aesthetically, I would say we've always really appreciated concision and surprise. We love good juxtaposition and some parataxis in there, and we love great leaps of imagination in pieces. We're a little less on the long, flowy prose traditional aspect, kind of fragmented narration or yeah, I think of it like for poetry, I think of it as like the Mary Jo Bang kind of model, expansive poems, but are so concise and pressurized in their delivery.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how, that's kind of aesthetically what we really seek is that, careful consideration of language and concision.
Sure. We have a question. Can you repeat the name of the food journal? Is it Ice Magazine? Ice Queen Magazine?
Ice Queen Magazine. It pays. It's $50 a contributor. Now she only does one featured artist or writer a month. But if you're the feature, it's your work, your recipe, your interview, and it's paid. And a paying market is a good market. So
So you mentioned young writers. So this is something that comes up a lot. I take it to mean young in terms of experience, not necessarily age, right? Because I think in terms of accessibility, sometimes older writers feel like a lot of the literary magazines are targeting people who are not them. So do you think about that in the works you publish, like trying to represent a range of experience?
Yes, I mean, we always favor emerging writers or new voices. Not to say that we don't have established voices that are also in our journal. We do our motto, and like when we have meetings, we always reiterate that what we're after is good writing. So that's our number one focus, and whatever we find, that's our range. We do, of course, have those conversations as well as how many voices are we showcasing and what are those voices. But in terms of going through the submission pool, a lot of it is blind reading, so you don't really know to begin with. But when it comes down to asking ourselves, what is our next endeavor or our next project going to be, we always are asking ourselves, well, how are we serving emerging writers first? That's always our primary goal.
Great. So take us through your editorial process. What happens when a submission comes in? Some people like it, some people don't. How does that all play out?
So for our journal submissions, we have a reading internship, and that education portion of the journal is a big part. Gasher Press, the umbrella corporation, is a nonprofit. So we are asking ourselves, not only how are we giving away kind of financial resources, but also educational resources. So our reading internship is a part of that. So when we get a submission, it's assigned to a group of readers, and then they go in, they are asked to make their kind of vote. Submittable has like their maybe, yes, no. And then we ask them to, kind of include a brief justification. What are you seeing in this work that makes you vote yes or makes you, a maybe? And then our editors, our genre editors, their job is to go in and to engage in conversation in those chat boxes. Submittable has, like a chat box kind of on the side for each piece, so you can engage in dialogue about that piece. And something that we ask our genre editors to do is to contribute to conversations that are being made there, as a teaching tool to teach readers how we're reading this work and how they're new editors, so teaching how to be editors, how to read work, and then engaging in a dialogue about the pieces themselves and what we're seeing. And then the genre editors make final selections at the very end from the whole pool. So they'll go through and they'll see these conversations and they'll make their final selections from there. And then they usually will notify all the readers and have a dialogue about these are the pieces that we submitted and why.
And do you ever come across pieces that you really like, but for some reason they're not in keeping with the Gasher identity? How do you handle those pieces?
Yeah, so I mean, again, we have an aesthetic that we're looking for. We actually are doing our first kind of print anthology style issue that is themed. It's called Cherry Moon, and it's for emerging voices from the Asian diaspora. And we brought in guest editors for that, and then our fiction editor Kaya Dirks, who's just incredible talent. It was the lead editor for that, and they had a lot of conversations about like, this is a really great piece and I love it, but I don't think that it fits into the aesthetic. And I always tell people, it's not a, when you get rejections from any journal, it's not a rejection, it's a decline. And a lot of times it's because people are having conversations of, do these all fit in a same, like in our aesthetic?
Mhm.
A good poem will always find its home. But not every home is the same color and shape, so is
Right.
this finding your home, um and so we do those. That was a really interesting conversation that was happening specifically for that issue. They engaged, the editors, our guest editors that came in for that, engaged really heavily about, does this fit Gasher's aesthetic? The journal were a little bit more, we have our basic aesthetic kind of interest, but we have always believed of giving our our genre editors autonomy. So
Mhm.
I always say, like, you're the editor of your genre, it's your genre, and that to me makes the journal, as the years go, it'll slowly change shape because as you bring in new editors, they'll bring in their own interest. Daniel, our CNF editor, definitely favors like voice, and
Mhm.
you can see a voice very heavy in the work. Versus Kaya, our fiction editor, who I think would lean a little bit more lyrical. Poetry, we're definitely again really into that kind of leaps of imagination, concision, a little bit of kind of pressure. Um, so it's fun because everyone kind of brings their own kind of angle. So the
Mhm.
journal has a little bit more ability to be flexible and playful issue
Sure.
to issue.
What are you seeing a lot of in submissions these days? Are you noticing repeating trends, repeating subject matter, repeating styles?
Yeah, I do. I do. I mean, one thing that for us is something that we'll pass on is if it feels too familiar.
Hmm.
We're really looking for work that surprises us. And so I think that there sometimes is a trend in writing. I mean, this has been, happening for forever, where people are writing, trying to imitate the style of the really popular writers of this time. So
Hmm.
I think we are seeing some of that. As far as subject matter, um, definitely, I would say seeing a lot more interest in like work that's focused on body, identity, politics. I mean, these are topics that are happening globally right now. So it makes sense that they're coming up in terms of themes. But we always are looking for voices that seem very uniquely themselves,
Hmm.
that nobody else could write that poem because it's so keenly, this poet's, voice. So something that's a little bit, surprising or a little bit different from what maybe we're seeing a lot of.
Sure. I noticed that you have on the site, so this is sort of something a lot of people are talking about now in the literary landscape, whether you remove a writer for like being problematic or something like that. And I noticed that you have on your mission statement a little line about that. Can you talk about your, or sort of Gasher's view about that? If a writer, that you publish a poem by them and then they go on Twitter and they say something that sort of goes against the Gasher ethos, how do you handle something like
It hasn't happened to us yet. So, I mean,
that?
thankfully, I think that the majority of writers are good people. I think it's a great community that we're a part of. But we do put that on there because Gasher is a place for everyone. And when somebody goes, on Twitter and has a rant about X group or whatever else, then it's made Gasher in some ways unwelcoming to that group now because it's, we're supporting this writer.
Mm,
We are supporting these writers. I mean, we publish them as a way of saying, like, we support this writer. But we I know that there's discussions of, you separate the art from the artist. I don't think that that's really possible in this day and age. I don't think it's responsible in this day and age either. So we don't do that. The writer is who we're supporting when we publish their work. So that's our philosophy. Other journals might take a different approach to it. And again, that's the beauty of having so many journals. You can find the journal that suits you, but we feel like we're supporting the writer when we publish them.
Mhm.
So character does count towards us. I haven't had this, we haven't seen this issue with any of our writers
Mhm.
so far. We also don't know what every writer is doing, at every given time. We've been publishing 4 issues a year for like, almost 5 years now. So, more so it'd be like if we're something really kind of catches our attention or somebody kind of
Yeah.
reports something like that.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's interesting to hear you say that you don't know what the writers are doing, because I think sometimes people read something like that and then they feel like the editors are now going to be monitoring. You publish a poem
Yeah.
journal and now they're going to be like on your Twitter feed looking at all your opinions and trying to decide if they
Yeah.
should keep your poem up or something like that. So, but it's kind of it's good to hear that there's sort of like a hands-off approach. It's
Yeah.
only if something comes up that is like really concerning.
Yeah, we're not after looking for bad guys. I mean, you know what I'm saying? Like, we're not out like hoping that we find a bad apple and like, then we're gonna, make a blast on Twitter. That's not our style.
Yeah.
It'll have to really be something that like caught our attention because it's, some of those things, as we know, get really blown up on Twitter.
Mhm.
That's how it would like come to our attention. But yeah, we're not like surveilling our records or anything like that.
Yeah. This is sort of a personal, or I'm looking for sort of personal guidance in this regard, but how do you navigate the online space as an online magazine, as editors who are trying to grow your audience and connect with readers, and then also recognizing that social media can be like just a huge headache, or worse. How do you kind of stay sane in this environment?
Um, well, professionalism is something that we really take to heart. There
Mhm.
are some journals out there. I mean, we just saw recently, with Hobart, for example, where like the editor is very present in the Twitter post. Like it's their voice and
Mhm.
it's their opinions, and you see them. Um, we are an organization, Gasher, I started it and I kind of oversee it, but it's a nonprofit. It doesn't have an owner. It's a collective group that runs it. So we don't have, a personal voice on our social media. We're an organization, and even outside of having a lot of editors who are supporting this journal, we're an organization that's representing a lot of writers. I mean, I don't have a personal opinion. I mean, so it's in some ways it's endearing to see there's some journals that do it very well, that can have a very personal voice and character on social media. I'm not witty or funny, so I don't do it. um but I also think that I've seen some journals where they kind of post about their private kind of dramas, or when they get mean emails from submitters. To me, it doesn't feel like there's a lot of benefit from doing it. I don't know like that why the energy spent doing that. We're really again focused on like these are our opportunities that we're offering, and like look at these cool voices.
Yeah.
We kind of keep ourselves out of the picture.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I'm
Yeah.
also terrified of Twitter. I'm terrified of Twitter. Social media is scary. I don't.
Yeah,
I'm
I think
scared.
everybody is a
Yeah.
little bit. That it's interesting. That kind of rubs me the wrong way too when editors post these kind of inappropriate submitter comments. It seems like that's a private relationship between submitter and editor.
Yeah, I feel like it starts to open up this sense of distrust that anything
Mhm.
you send can be sent out to the public or put on blast,
Yeah,
you
yeah,
know. So yeah, we try to keep away from that.
sure. How do you handle, as a magazine that's geared toward accessibility and really trying to encourage new writers, how do you handle sending out rejections?
That's a hard one. Um, We do tiered rejections for one, to really encourage the voices that we see. We also have a rejection, rejection. I don't want to say it's a template, but the way that we instruct our editors to send personal rejections to writers that we know are minors. So like if we can tell that they're like in high school, or they're like saying like they're a freshman at this university, we usually try to send a more personal email, just so that we're not crushing spirits so early in their writing career.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, it is, we get thousands of submissions per issue. It's, I do see sometimes submitters. I'm a submitter myself. I mean, I submit to journals, so I totally understand where you just feel like you've gotten 10 rejections in a row and you feel beaten down. Mm-hmm. I get that frustration of feeling like these form rejections are so impersonal. I've just sent you my personal work. But it's just not feasible for us to send personal rejections. I mean, poetry alone gets, 700 to 1,000 submissions each issue. So it's just not feasible to that. We do our best to try, but we stick to a pretty professional form letter as well. Just saying like it's not, again, a good poem will find its home, but it's not always going to be right time, right place, right editor. I mean, there's only so many editors who make these final decisions. I mean, at the end of the day, submitting is, the best advice I ever got was submitting is arbitrary.
Yeah.
And that was like, whew, it feels great now. It really is. It's a lot of times it's really arbitrary. You could get somebody on a bad day reading through submissions, and it's just it's just kind of the way it is.
Yeah. So that said, is there something a submitter can do to really stand out from the crowd? Are there certain biases that the editors have, maybe in terms of like imagery or humor or strong character? And maybe if it helps to point to recent pieces that you've accepted and talk about like what was it that really grabbed the editor and made that piece stand out from the pile?
Yeah, so we just actually announced our Best of Net nominees for this year, so we can kind of look at some of those writers as well. I mean, overall, I would say you have to think in terms of, this was something that I didn't really recognize as a submitter myself until I was an editor on the other side, which is that it's not that your poem isn't good, it's that I've looked at 500 poems. So I do them maybe in like 120, submission batches. It's hard to stand out, in such a big pile. So what we really encourage is surprise, leaps of surprise. What we're kind of turned off by are familiar imagery. So that's actually something that I see a lot in our comments. It's a good poem, but the imagery is really familiar, or I don't feel like the syntax is really purposeful, where you're breaking your lines. I mean, start asking yourself, where are I had Janine Joseph is this incredible poet who actually has a new book that's going to be coming out from Alice James Books in the spring called Decade on the Brain. And I've read some of the poems from it and it's amazing. So I hope everyone goes and gets it. But she once talked about, you should look at a poem for opportunities. Where in your poem does it open to new opportunities? And that's where we get this idea of like surprise. Where did I see an opportunity in the line where I broke it, or in the syntax, or in this imagery, or in the progression of the poem, or the ordering of the poem. I had Noah Eli Gordon as a professor at CU Boulder who used to do this thing where he would just flip your poem upside down and read it, from the bottom up. And sometimes it made no sense, but it was so interesting how the lines had new relation, and then you could start thinking through it. So I would say that's a good suggestion when you're revising your poems for journal publication. The poems in the book can look totally different than the poems you publish in journals. That's another thing. Give yourself freedom for those poems to look different, because in a book they have each other to lean on, to make connections, to further a picture. But you don't have that in a journal. You have the poem isolated. So if it might need to do a little bit more somersaulting than it does in the book. And I think that's one thing that submitters get a little too attached to the original poem, that they don't find success with it as an individual in the journal because they're so attached to it in their idea of how this would work in a collection.
Mm.
I'm a project writer, so I really get stuck there thinking like, well, it does so many cool things in the book when you put it in all these different poems around it, but that doesn't mean that a journal is going to see it and see it as like one unit.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that we suggest is some, and this is different from different journals, but for our journal, having your packets have some cohesion when you submit. So some journals will say like, give us just all your best, and they can be all different like forms and subject matters, and they can just kind of be like a collection. And I think those are great. I submit like that to a lot of places as well. I think it'll stand out more in the big slush pile if it has some sort of thread, some sort of cohesion to it. That doesn't mean that it's all written in the same form, but there's something that's echoed in the poems. There's something that feels, like a group, because a group of poems are going to have more impact than this one.
Mm-hmm.
So that's something
Yeah.
that, poets can and writers can kind of do as well. We have, pretty big variety. So, for poetry, just from our Best of Net, James O'Leary was published in the same issue as Day Hessinger Nixon. And, Day's piece, Etude, is long. It's kind of prose fragment blocks, and it has, these Polaroid photos throughout it. And then you have James O'Leary, which is this tight, kind of just prose block.
Mm.
And so they really kind of struck us by
Mm.
their individuality. They didn't seem very traditional. We
Mm.
don't have a lot of poems that maybe feel traditional in nature. We're not a journal that necessarily is looking for traditional form. I mean, if there's going to be form, we hope that you like break it in some way. That's kind of our interest there. Again, since we brought on Daniel, our CNF, Daniel is a wonderful editor and actually has taken many pieces that would have gotten rejected and have worked personally with those writers to edit the piece so that we can publish it later. Daniel is just really fantastic, and they also work at Split Lip Press as well. So I say anything that you can do with Daniel as your editor is good. But they usually look for a lot of voice in their pieces, and definitely very human stories,
Mm-hmm.
people being people in real life, people-y situations. That's what I would say. It's the people-y thing. And then, I would say that, Kaya again has more of a bit of a lyric take on things. So the fiction, Catherine Wong, for example, has a lot of, I would say, that kind of parataxis movement where there's kind of breath almost in between sentences. Not that it's out of the prose form, but just that it feels a little bit more, I would say, like cleared out.
Can you define that term for people such as myself who may not know what it means?
I would say out of the kind of excess, so like when you think, in terms of like that kind of hypotaxis, just really flowing into, and you have these kind of larger sentences, and you have maybe some longer bridging work that you're doing between one scene to the next. We really find you'll see a lot of our work over the years will kind of favor those fragmented prose pieces where we have like prose block, and then the next one has skipped to almost like a new scene. We like that fragmented storytelling where there's a little less connection, so a little bit more, again, kind of leaps of imagination can occur. And then even like within the lines, we favor a little bit more of that like kind of concision. We don't want to rest too long in one area before we move. So our pieces are, I like to think of them like kind of like a river. You kind of are carried through the piece almost against your will because they move, in a pace, in a very like, conscious pacing. you're not like wandering around the forest looking at cool things. It's like we're going and we're going here and then we're going here. We cannot stop it and we're going. So
Right. Right. Is there a sweet spot in terms of length? I see you guys accept fiction up to or prose up to 3,000 words.
mhm.
That yeah, tell us about like the what is the sweet spot? What is there a trend in what you typically accept?
We do typically accept on the shorter side, I would say. Um, personally, I love Flash. I think that, and again, it's kind of the magic that can happen in any sort of Flash piece. And so maybe that's why we kind of favor things on the shorter end. Obviously, maybe around like 1500 to 1750 is probably a sweet spot
Okay.
for a lot of pieces. Um, we're hoping this upcoming year to open a Flash CNF contest.
Mm.
So we'll kind of really be looking into doing more there. But we do have I mean, it's a pretty broad length that we have there. I think the minimum is 100 words, and the max is 3,000. And that's because again, we're pretty open. We're just looking for things that interest and excite us. So we're
Mhm.
pretty open in terms of what that looks like on the page.
Sure. And you mentioned surprise, but I think it's an important distinction between surprise and shock, right? So you don't, I'm
Yes.
guessing, or as an editor, you're not necessarily going to respond positively to something that's deliberately shocking.
Yeah.
But surprise in a good way, linguistic surprise or, interesting juxtapositions, that's the kind of thing that you're into.
Yeah, I think shock is a deliberate intention,
Mm.
right? And so it feels very much like the writer going, and now I'm going to do this. And then, that's, I can see, you can almost see the construction. It feels
Mm.
it's very intentional. That takes away from any sort of kind of magic that's supposed to happen there.
Mm.
I mean, usually what happens is shock turns into just really graphic or something that like we're not interested in anyways. Um, but I always think of surprise as the the writer leaning into where the work is carrying them. There's like that book I think every undergrad reads it, and it's a great book called Art of Attention by Donald Revel. And it's really that's where surprise comes from. When you are really attentive to what your language is doing, or again, what opportunities are in a particular line or in a particular section, that's where surprise happens. It's an attention to the language and allowing that to carry you into these interesting moments that you didn't construct out of intention. You found as you were writing.
Sure. So tell us what keeps you doing this, what keeps you in the game, what keeps you going. It sounds like the magazine is continually expanding, which is great. You have a more supportive staff, you redefine your mission, but you're also a working writer, poet, and probably, I imagine, working on the side. So how do you juggle it all, and what keeps you like excited about the literary journal?
Um, I mean, fatigue is real. And
Mhm.
so, one thing is really helpful is to have a really amazing team, which we do. I mean, I've had personal things happen where I've said, like, hey, I need to take a step back for the next month. And I know I can do that because I have a really great team that we lean back on. But also, I mean, it's really hard to get fatigue when there's so much good work being produced. I mean, one way that we kind of keep ourselves invested, or specifically, me, just because I um, do a lot of like the work that's not fun, which is like, billing and, all
Mhm.
that kind of like behind the scenes stuff that's like absolutely not enjoyable. It's by always thinking of new projects that we can do.
Mhm.
Cherry Moon, the anthology type journal was kind of thought of on a whim, but it's been, you know, amazing work is, going to be featured in it next summer. So, that's exciting. And, we just recently got back our book covers for our, two new full length books that we're doing. And, they're incredible. And,
Mhm.
we are always encountering new voices that are just so amazing. The new chapbook that we're going to be coming out with Aaron Zhang. I mean, Liz, our chapbook editor, and I were on Slack for like an hour just being like, I cannot believe, like just shooting lines back and forth, like from the manuscript, like look at this line, look at that line.
Wow.
So
That's
those
really
are the
cool.
things that really keep us invested, is just by enjoying the work that's coming in.
Yeah, that's super cool. So if anyone is watching this, listening to this and thinking, yes, this is the journal I want to send my next piece to, when should they submit, and what kind of deadlines, dates should they look out for on the horizon?
So our fall issue that's coming out November 1st recently closed. So we're not currently open for that journal submission, and we're changing our model. So for next year. So this year we were still doing 4 issues a year. It's gotten so big. We're
Mhm.
trying to prevent burnout from our editors and our interns, because it's just so much work that we're getting in. So we are moving our model to a biannual issue starting next year. So the next open reading period or submissions period for the spring issue that would come out in like the March, April area, it's going to open November 1st and it'll close January 31st. And then next year we'll open again for the fall issue, June 1st to August 31st.
That's
So
great. And is there a specific theme, or is it just open submissions?
we're always just open. I mean, that's part of the fun. It's just
That's
seeing what
great.
comes through.
Yeah. Open and free. Awesome.
Open and free.
Well, thank you so much, Whitney. This was really interesting, very pleasurable to talk to you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for coming, and I will be in touch soon. Thank you.
Thank you.